For the past 30 years or so, I've been driving around eastern Kentucky and the western Virginias and conducting interviews with everyday people. The goal is to someday publish a book entitled A Secret History of Appalachia, comprising all the more fascinating but more importantly mysterious stories that I've recorded along the way. I'm talking about the stuff that didn't end up in any newspaper or book, but stayed in the mouths, ears, and minds of people that either experienced them or still tell the tales. People have told me about murders they've seen, or the ones they've claimed to have committed, and I've also heard about daring escapes from abusive marriages, people vanishing in the woods, and more fatal mining accidents than I care to remember. Most are what I like to call ordinary tragedies, and by that I mean they're things that many of us have either experienced or can relate to. But then there are a handful of stories I describe as extraordinary, the ones that still spring fresh to mind all this time later, and that don't have much in the way of rational explanation. Which brings me to a visit that I made to Perry County, Kentucky in the fall of 1997. Perry County sits right at the heart of Appalachian, Kentucky, and the first thing I noticed was how wild some of the place names were. There's a little hamlet up north called Rowdy, a town called Hazard, and one called Viper. There's even a town called Krypton, but it's named after the nearby gas deposits, not Superman. But it was while walking down Baker Street in a little place called Combs that an old man sitting on his red-painted porch croaked up, "You lost." When I told him I was right where I wanted to be, he gave me a confused look and asked, "What's that supposed to mean?" I explained the whole reason I traveled to places like Combs was to talk to people like him, and then I told him about the book and all of that, and his eldest son walked out onto the porch to join us. When I gave the son the Cliff Notes version, he pointed to his paw and told me that he had enough stories to fill a book and then some. Because the old man I'd encountered, up until the age of about 30 when he met his wife, used to be a bona fide outlaw who'd been in and out of prison for various acts of armed robbery. I'd have happily listened to every story that old outlaw had to offer me, but I know folks got better things to do than to sit and yap with a nosy old so-and-so like me. And so what I tend to do is ask them to tell the one story that means the most to them, or the one that they think America really ought to know about. The younger of the two suggested to his dad to tell me the wrong truck story from after he got back from the war. Lemuel, or Lem for short, must have been in his mid to late 70s, but while his mind was still pretty sharp, his storytelling abilities weren't quite what they used to be, so he asked his son to tell me the story instead. And so it all starts when Lemuel returned from France after serving in the infantry during the war. It's a widely accepted myth that the soldiers who came back from Europe slipped seamlessly back into their old lives. And while it's true that a lot of veterans come back with a profound peace and a greater appreciation of life, that's not true for all. Lem was just 20 years old when he fought the Germans in North Africa. And then when the job was done, he fought them in Italy, then France, and then finally Germany, until that son of a bitch running Germany took the coward's way out. And the war in Europe was finished, and a few months later, the war in the Pacific was done too. But the war in Lem's mind wasn't even close to being finished. Thanks to the GI Bill passed in 1944, Lem was entitled to receive a free college education, all paid for on the taxpayer's dime. He enrolled in an engineering course in 1947, but was thrown out in only his second semester after socking one of his professors right in the mouth. Apparently this professor had a thing or two to say about what happened over there in Europe, things old Lem didn't take too kindly to. Having sworn off college as places people are taught to be stupid, Lem got himself a job at a mechanic shop in Hazard, and that's how he got his hands on his very own motorcycle. He'd ridden a Harley Liberator while he was over in Europe, not in a professional capacity, mind you, just for fun. But boy, was it fun. So much fun that when he and his boss had a bashed-up S125 come into the shop, Lem didn't offer to fix it. He straight up offered to buy it. And that's how by the summer of 1949, Lem had joined a motorcycle club based down in Harlan. And while they didn't have flaming skulls on their leather or a name like Satan's hamsters, their collective addiction to adrenaline started to have a greater and greater influence over time. Eastern Kentucky's always been a poor place. Even when it was the economic backbone of the region, it was the mining executives who took home the biggest slice of pie, while leaving the miners themselves to fight it out over the crumbs. A lot of vets didn't mind, especially the ones who didn't have the smarts for college, because pulling coal out of the ground sure as hell beats getting shot at, but not everyone saw it that way. Lem and his buddies at the club hadn't helped liberate Europe just to come back home and break their backs down there in the dark. No, if they weren't going to be given what they deserved by helping save the whole damn world, they were going to take it. At least that's what they told themselves, so they could go back to doing not so much what they wanted, but were conditioned to do: find the enemy and defeat them. And to me, the group's attitude is best summed up by their leader, a man by the name of Johnny Gordon. According to Lem, Johnny was the great-great-great-great-grandson of his namesake John Gordon, who was simultaneously a pioneer, planter, trader, and soldier. And it wasn't hard to believe that Johnny had the same blood in him. He was the president of the motorcycle club, a full-time engine mechanic, and a fine banjo player. Not to mention an excellent brewer of homemade wine who knew how to grow, harvest, and process his own tobacco. But back during the war, Johnny had fought the Japanese in the Pacific, not as a regular soldier, but as a Marine raider. The rest of the boys would go from island to island, storming beaches, capturing airfields, and clearing the Japanese out of their bunkers. But Johnny and his boys had a very difficult job. Before the main body of troops invaded an island, the Marines would send in the raiders at night to cause chaos and inflict casualties. And while the regular guys fought with discipline, obeying the laws of war and following a strict chain of command, the raiders fought like savages. They slipped into Japanese encampments late at night, cutting sentries' throats before tossing whole bundles of hand grenades into the places they slept. Two of their favorite things were killing officers and blowing up big guns. But the thing they loved the most was taking scalps. I don't mean literally, of course. That would have gotten them into a whole ton of trouble. But the raiders loved taking home flags, weapons like those samurai swords, or even just pieces of Japanese uniform to show off how close they'd gotten to them without picking up so much as a scratch. And that's all Johnny did for years and years, hit-and-run attacks in the dead of night before running back to the boats, sometimes carrying 2 whole armfuls of loot. And while not many would actually say it out loud, folks like Johnny Gordon actually missed the war, and he wasn't the only one. So when Johnny wanted to put together a posse, one that'd halt and rob trucks that came through Perry County at night, he was surprised to find that half the club wanted in on it, Lemmy included. Now, after enlisting the help of some scouts over in Laurel County, where there was a big old truck stop the long haulers used to visit, the first truck Johnny and Lem ran down was wall-to-wall cigarettes. They pulled up alongside the cab on their bikes and fired a sawed-off shotgun into the air to get the driver's attention. And then they'd fill up the bed of a truck driven by one of their guys, then tear off down the road and onto the back roads before the cops even heard that there had been a robbery. They sold what they stole on the black market, split the take equally between whoever was on the job, and then waited for the next piece of intel to come in, telling them when and where to be. And that's how they stayed sane, I guess. Uncle Sam had turned them into men who needed a war to fight, so when they got home to Perry, they waged one of their very own, where the spoils were theirs to keep. Johnny and the boys kept up their truck robberies for literally years in the Appalachian area, despite both the cops trying to find them and the truck companies trying to avoid them, and it was all because of what Johnny learned in the raiders. They'd strike in seemingly random places so they weren't at all predictable, but more importantly, they never got too greedy either. Raiding was essentially a game of risk management. Wherever they were at their lowest, that's where you were going to hit. Through sticking to that same raider doctrine that he'd been taught, Johnny and his boys were successful time and time again, and according to Lem's son, they made a heck of a lot of money from it too. They hit cigarette trucks, liquor trucks, trucks hauling fine leathers or ladies' dresses. Anything they could get a decent resale value on, they'd steal it. And they even hit a wagon with an armed escort that had been hauling silver across the country. But after that, the company never sent a truck through eastern Kentucky ever again. They had themselves a good old time in that first year or so. But after a while, the prey started to thin out. Some trucking companies changed their times and routes so nothing ever went out at night, and if it did, they sure as hell didn't pass through Perry County. Johnny and his boys started making less and less money, and at one point, it looked like they'd be forced to hang up their gloves, as it were. But then came the call that changed everything for them, when the scouts over in Laurel heard a rumor about a heavily guarded convoy that was set to pass through Perry County that night. The scouts said the convoy consisted of 3 vehicles. One vehicle coming up the rear with its passengers openly carrying shotguns, followed by a large truck so clumsy and slow-looking that it just had to be armored-plated on the sides. Then up front was a flatbed, again containing armed passengers, only this one had a manned machine gun turret set up in the back. No, they weren't traveling across the whole country like that, just eastern Kentucky, and all thanks to the work Johnny and his boys had been doing. And all that armed security had to mean one thing. Whatever they were hauling, it had to be worth 5, maybe even 6 figures at resale. Johnny was dead set on hitting that truck, and he didn't care if they had to kill to get at what it was hauling. It was like the good Lord himself had placed their final job right there in front of them, so they could retire and quit while they were still ahead. But not all the raiders agreed with him. Some suggested it was a trap, one the trucking companies were counting on the raiders taking the bait on. But Johnny said that there was no way in hell that they'd outfit a truck with such expensive protection unless they really didn't want them getting their hands on it. And folks were also asking why the hell they'd send a convoy through Perry County at night. But to Johnny, it was a question of speed. Whoever wanted those goods transported wanted them moved fast, and that meant no detours. Besides, the moment Johnny heard about those armed guards, he didn't just see it as a job anymore. He saw it as a challenge. Johnny managed to convince 5 of his boys to ride with him that night, Lem included. But their usual plan was just far too risky given the circumstances. He sent one of his boys out on this bike to act as a lookout, and then once he was sure the convoy was on its way down, Johnny put the first phase of his plan into action. Sometime later, when the armed convoy was within just a few miles of Hazard, the lead vehicle spotted 2 big fires burning in the darkness ahead of them. Then when they got closer, they found 2 burning cars and a man claiming to be from the Perry County Sheriff's Department. The deputy, who was in fact one of Johnny's boys carrying a fake badge, directed them down Couchtown Road, claiming if they followed it, it'd take them right into Hazard and back onto the highway. The men in the lead vehicle seemed a little on edge, but they also had a schedule to keep, so they thanked the deputy for his directions and then turned off onto Couchtown. But rather than lead them into Hazard, the road led them towards nothing but an ambush. Johnny opened up on the lead vehicle with an old bar, and on the fast fire setting too, not the slower one, and the driver either panicked or was killed instantly because it jerked to the side before flipping over and blocking the road. Lem said the machine gunner was killed instantly as he was thrown from the back of the truck, having never even fired a shot. The cargo truck smashed into the upturned vehicle in front, I guess from where the driver wanted to just get out of the ambush zone, but all it did was stop the truck, not clear the way. Lem and the boys then rushed out of the dark trees at the side of the road and took the occupants of the 3rd vehicle prisoner without any bloodshed. Out of 11 guys, Johnny and his boys only killed 3 members of that convoy to get what they wanted. The rest of them had their weapons taken away before they were forced to lie down in the dirt with their hands on the back of their heads. Sporting the cloth mask and hat Johnny wore during robberies, he walked up and down the line of disarmed men, asking who the driver was and what was in the truck. Even way back then, professional truck drivers needed to know what they were hauling. It was even written into law. So when the driver claimed not to know, Johnny didn't believe him. He didn't need any keys or codes or anything. Lem and the boys were in the process of breaking into the cargo box regardless. He was just curious what all the security was for. And so when the driver claimed not to know what was in the back, he figured they were in for the score of a lifetime, just like he'd predicted. Lem told me himself that he thought that they'd be greeted by a wall of gold bars when they popped that can open, because it took them a whole 20 minutes to cut through all the locks and bolts sealing it shut. Then when they clipped off the last one, and the doors stood ready to be heaved open, Johnny said he wanted the honor of being the first one inside. Maybe there was a little part of Johnny that believed it was a trap, on account of the driver not knowing what was inside. He didn't want to tell someone else to open the doors only for them to be greeted by a second machine gun and a hail of bullets. So instead of ordering the doors open, Johnny told Lem to hold his horses, then walked up to the doors himself. Lem said when Johnny pulled open the doors, it was dark inside. He had nothing but a weak flashlight to light it up. So to get a closer look at what they'd captured, he climbed up inside the cargo box alone. Lem said he and his boys were just itching to know what was inside, and even the prisoners lying there in the dirt were looking up to get a glimpse of what they'd been hauling. But when Johnny was done looking around and found what he'd been searching for, the whole atmosphere changed. He called out for a crowbar at one point and would be heard cursing as he rifled through what sounded like boxes of straw after popping their lids off with the crowbar. Then suddenly, everything went quiet, and when Johnny spoke next, that's when everything changed. A guy named Tommy called out to him asking what he'd found, but Johnny only replied, "Don't come in here, Tommy. It's not what we thought." Lem said he walked towards the open door and had one hand on the box's floor when Johnny told him that if he climbed into the box, he'd shoot him dead. He sounded serious too, deadly serious, and not like a greedy kind of serious either, more like terrified. Lem said Johnny hopped out of the box a second later, carrying what looked to be a wooden box under his arm. It looked expensive, so whatever was inside, it had to be expensive too, but then Tommy demanded to see what was inside. Johnny had a pistol on him before he could so much as take a single step forward. Johnny swore that he'd give each one of them $500 the very next day if they just stopped asking questions and let him leave with the box. But Lem said that just for a moment there, it seemed like his boys weren't going to allow it. I can sympathize with him too in a way. The arrangement had been the same for years on end, and now they had this big score land in their lap, and the one they all thought that they could retire on, and Johnny suddenly wanted to keep it all for himself. Lem said Johnny had to swear on his mama's life that he'd already looked inside and that they didn't want no part of what was in that box. He'd never lied to them before, and he wasn't about to start then, and then he swore that as the years went by, they'd come to thank him for not showing them, not curse him for it. Lem said he remembered the heavy silence that hung in the air as the boys made up their minds, and then, one by one, he and the boys agreed to take the $500, rather than even see what was in Johnny's mystery box. Lem said they trusted Johnny with their lives, so while anyone else might have had a mutiny on their hands, Johnny's boys were willing to take him at his word and agreed to take the cash instead. Before they cut their prisoners loose, they torched all 3 vehicles. And then as they shot up their gas tanks and put their lighters to the fluid, Lem said he asked Johnny to level with him and tell him what was inside. In reply, Johnny gave the only clue he ever issued when he said, "Something that won't burn." And after that, they made sure their prisoners stayed face down in the dirt during their departure, and then they ran off to where their bikes were stashed and went their separate ways. Lem said that was the usual agreement, split up and lay low. But rather than keep up appearances at his day job and sitting on the loot until the heat had died down, Johnny stayed true to his word. He paid each man $500 in cash for their services that previous night, and he also took that fancy-looking box on a little journey up into the hills, where he buried it someplace a pastor had told him to. At least, that's what he told Lem when they talked about it just the one time. He said it was about 2 weeks later after he stopped by Johnny's place to see how he and his family were doing. Johnny said he was doing fine and his wife and kids seemed well enough, but the man himself didn't look so hot. He said he'd been feeling under the weather ever since the job, but that all he needed was a little rest and he'd be right as rain again. But that's when Lem asked what he did with the box and what was inside. And Johnny said he didn't really know what was in that box, but that whatever it was appeared small and withered and dark, almost like a half-rotten yarn or something. Another man might be confused why such an item might require such secure transportation, but Johnny didn't need to ask. Just laying eyes on it filled him with this terrible sense of dread, and from the moment he opened the box until the moment he closed it, he felt this strange sensation of cold nausea run through him, almost like it was poisonous or toxic somehow. Johnny made the decision to take it before he even knew what he was going to do with it. All he could be certain of was that he didn't want it getting anywhere near his boys. I guess if this story had taken place in some other area of the country, Johnny might have taken the box to a university to have scientists run tests on it or something. But over there in eastern Kentucky, his first thought was to take it to a man of God, to ask his opinion on it. Johnny said he took the box to the church his mama used to pray at, and then showed it to the pastor there after explaining what had happened. He said he'd been scared the pastor was going to tell him to return it, and then confessed what he'd done to the county sheriff. Only he didn't. Instead, the pastor tells him to take the box to this one particular spot in the hills. It had to be this one place, nowhere else. Then when he got there, he was to dig a hole, deep as he would a grave, before burying the box down there in the rocky mountain soil. Johnny said that he did just as the pastor told him and dug a hole so deep his back ached by the time he saw it was good and finished. But as he walked back to his truck, he realized he felt that same cold sickness he felt back in the cargo box that previous night. He told Lem that he figured it was some kind of secret government thing that they'd stumbled across, like some sort of ingredient for a secret weapon, like the one they used on the Japanese to get them to surrender finally. But he could never know for sure, and I guess all the pastor had tried to do was either keep his ass out of jail, because he sure as heck didn't know what it was either. Lem said they never did figure out what they stole, but he knows what it did, and what it did was kill his friend. Johnny never stopped feeling under the weather after that night robbing the truck. In fact, he got worse and worse and skinnier over the course of about 2 years before he finally slipped away during the night. The doctors couldn't figure out what was wrong with him. They ran all kinds of tests and sent him to see all kinds of specialists to see if it was the cancer getting to him. But no one could work out what the problem was. All they said was that the symptoms suggested some kind of wasting disease, but one they couldn't even slow the effects of, let alone cure. Lem said the whole motorcycle club showed up to see Johnny off, but that 2 funerals took place that day, Johnny's and the club's. The club died with him and ended up sharing his grave, but Lem never forgot about the job that killed his old buddy Johnny, and he was willing to bet no one else had either, if they're still breathing, that is. And you know something? Johnny's is a story I don't think I'll be forgetting anytime soon either, because it's one that deals with a subject I hear addressed often, a story of a flawed man, but one whose heart was always in the right place. On a remote pig farm in Canada, life seemed to move at its own strange pace. The property became known for late-night gatherings, wandering rumors, and a sense that something was not quite right. As the years passed, whispers grew louder, drawing attention to the isolated farm and its owner, Robert Picton. What emerged from the mud and silence would become one of the darkest mysteries in Canadian criminal history. Listen to the full story over on my true crime channel, Saturn Soul, linked down below. Long ago, at the dawn of the 1990s, in the days that I could still walk upstairs without my damn knees aching, my buddies and I used to be quite the outdoorsmen. We all met after joining the outing club at Dartmouth, which is basically the fancy old-timey name for hiking and camping club. And then after graduation, when one of us went back to school down at West Virginia University, the Appalachian Trail called out to us. We decided on a place called Dolly Sods, and while that might sound like the drag name of an old British man, it's actually the name of a wilderness area about 3 hours' drive from Morgantown. We figured we'd start at the Bear Rocks trailhead, and then we'd camp at the creek, and then complete the loop on our second day via Big Stone Coal. It'd give us plenty of leeway to check places at our leisure, and that while it'd be a challenge, it'd still be enjoyable and not just a pure grind. But what none of us realized when we went off on that day was that none of us would be making it to the campsite that evening. So on that first day, we were walking along the trail after being on the move all day when I started falling behind because nature was calling. I told the guys to keep going and that I'd catch up to them in no time, and then I ducked off into the bushes to do my thing. Now, this wasn't a quick stop either. It was very much a pants-down situation, and I don't know about you guys, but it always takes me a minute or two out in the woods because I have a very irrational fear of a bobcat jumping up my butt and running off with my spleen, or maybe a spider crawling up my poop. Now, thankfully, I was able to take care of business before I saw him, but literally just as I'm finishing up, I see this dude walk out from behind a tree off in the distance. He was wearing a red bandana or something that was covering most of his face, and a long coat that looked way too heavy for how hot the weather was. But what put the fear of God into me was when I saw him dragging a limp human body into view behind him. He was dragging another person who was either dead or unconscious, I couldn't tell, and he was dragging him like it was nothing. People are heavy. Like, have you ever tried carrying someone? You can't just drag a grown-ass man along the forest floor like that, not unless you have goddamn super strength or something. And so the second I saw them, I dropped the asswipe, pulled my pants up, and then crept back towards the trail as quickly and quietly as I could. I didn't think he'd spotted me. He certainly didn't call out or anything, but my adrenaline was spiking by the time I caught up with my friends. I spared no detail, and after only briefly asking if I was pranking them or not, they took me at my word and we started moving as fast as we could down the trail. We couldn't run with our packs, obviously, not for any sustained period, so we ended up basically power walking down the trail while trying to figure out which of the upcoming trailheads would take us to town, and to some kind of sheriff's department that I could file a report at. But before long, the sun started dropping and we realized that we weren't going to make it to any kind of civilization before dark. Realizing we had little choice, we kept going through the night, headlamps on with long sticks in hand, while we jumped at every snap of a twig or rustle of a bush. We were convinced someone was about to jump us, but thankfully it didn't look like anyone was following us. The exhaustion started to hit really hard around 1 in the morning, and if it wasn't for all that adrenaline, I just know that I'd have tapped out around then. But just talking about what I saw or speculating on what it was, and suddenly I didn't feel so tired anymore. Finally, as the sky starts lightening up, we hit a trailhead that spits us out near the small town. We were dead on our feet, with legs like jelly, and we were covered in sweat and dirt, so we found a spot just off the trail to collapse for a quick breather before we made our way into the town. Now the sun was barely up, and the birds had just started chirping, and for a second there, it felt like maybe we overreacted, and that everything was going to be just fine. But then suddenly, my buddy Josh points back towards the trail and says, "You all see that, right?" And we all look over to where he's pointing, and there, we see this thin line running between the two trees. It was a tripwire, a no-joke tripwire right there where we were about to walk, and that's when the fear really kicked in. We didn't touch it or go near it, we just backed away slowly, convinced that someone had set it up for us, or people like us. We ditched the main path and started cutting through the woods with no real plan except putting distance between us and whatever was waiting for us if we triggered that trap. And that's when my friend notices someone moving parallel to us through the trees. Not close enough to make out details about him, like that red face cover, but he was definitely shadowing us. He'd stop when we stopped, shifted when we shifted, and it wasn't some random hiker either. There was no way. And then once we were all in agreement to run, I gave a signal, and we went running through the woods together as fast as we could. Luckily, we were way closer to town by that point, so it was only maybe 5 or 10 minutes of sprinting before we broke through the trees and spotted the trailhead. And then about after 20 minutes of power walking and looking over our shoulders, we walked into town, found the sheriff's office, and told a deputy about the entire story. From the body, to the tripwire, to the guy who seemed to be stalking us when we walked off the trail. In all fairness, they took the report very seriously, and the sheriff sent a deputy out to check the areas that we mentioned. But on our way out of town, we get a call saying that there are no signs of any struggle, no tripwires or suspicious drag marks, nothing like that at all. We could tell the deputies went from taking us seriously to thinking that we were just a bunch of city kids who'd gotten our panties in a twist, probably after seeing some perfectly normal, albeit illegal, hunting activity. But that's not what I saw, man. Not by a long shot. We didn't go back, and we never planned to either. That whole stretch just left a bad taste, like we stumbled onto something we weren't supposed to see and barely got out unharmed. Part of me still wonders what the hell I saw out there, and if you're ever out on the Appalachian Trail and those remote spots that feel a little too isolated, keep your eyes open, because it can get really dangerous out there where there's no one else around. So my name's Brace, and I work in the safety department of a mining company here in West Virginia. That means I talk to a lot of veteran miners and union guys, and if there's one thing that they like to do, it's tell stories from their times in the trenches. And this is from McDowell County, way down south near where the Virginias meet Kentucky. McDowell was basically built on coal, and back in the day, it was one of the top producers in the entire country. Right now, the county's population is around 17,000. Way back when, almost 100,000 people called it home. Almost 3/4 of them belonged to mining families. Wages were some of the best in the industry. In West Virginia, coal fed mills and powered plants all over the nation. Whole towns became dependent on the mines to put food on their tables, but that meant as the government started shifting away from coal and towards things like nuclear and renewables, it hit Appalachia coal miners hard. People either moved out or found work in other industries. But some families, including mine, have deep, deep roots in the mines of McDowell County and weren't so quick to up and leave. And that's how so many stories accumulated, I guess, being passed down from one generation to another, and out of all the ones I've heard, this one probably makes the best campfire tale in terms of the sheer chill factor. So one day, I'm visiting Ekman on something fairly routine when this old foreman asked if I'd heard about the guy who tried to blow up mine number 44 back in the 70s. Turns out, I had heard the story before, or at least a version of it, about a guy who got trapped in a tunnel in a nearby mine after a collapse. Now, I was told his buddies didn't even realize he was missing for a whole day. Then when they got back to him, they messed up the excavation too, leaving him down there for almost a whole extra day before they finally got him out. According to the version I was told, the guy was so mad that when he came back to work, he stole a bunch of ANFO, a kind of explosive gel that you can pour into blast holes, and tried to take revenge by blowing up the mine and burying everyone on shift alive. Someone stopped him, worked out what he was trying to do, and he ended up getting shot by a guard before he could blow the mine, and himself, sky high. But according to the old-timer I was working with that day, that's not how it happened. And then over coffee and some pepperoni rolls, this is what he told me. Sometime back in '73, 30 miners were working the longwall face deep in mine number 44 when a deep groan suddenly rumbled through the mountain. Then before they knew it, A massive roof fall of slate and rock completely sealed the main entry, trapping them behind a wall of debris. A rescue operation started immediately, and for the next 30 hours or so, the men rigged brattice cloth for ventilation, rationed what little water they had, and waited in the light of their battery lamps while rescue crews worked to free them. And finally, after more than an entire day's worth of excavating, the rescue teams broke through with their heavy machinery and brought the whole terrible thing to an end. Or so they thought. Everyone assumed the count was complete, but before people could start celebrating, they realized a miner named Bobby Ray Miller was still unaccounted for. He'd been working the tail end when the fall hit, meaning that he was trapped somewhere behind a second layer of debris without anybody hearing his weak cries for help. Rescue teams returned to the mine and got to work digging right away. But in their rush to rescue the trapped miner, they triggered a fresh collapse, which not only set the operation back by something like 22 hours, but might have killed the very person they were trying to save. After hastily re-timbering the passage and clearing the new fall, the rescue crews finally reached Bobby Ray on the second night. They found him in a small pocket, suffering from a head wound, cracked ribs, severe dehydration, and near-fatal carbon monoxide exposure. After hauling him onto a stretcher, they carried him into the moonlight outside. He was alive, but barely, and he spent weeks in the hospital for what was a slow and painful recovery. At first, he drifted in and out of consciousness as the doctors monitored him closely for black lung complications and possible brain swelling. And then when he was strong enough to be discharged, that's when the physical therapy started. Bobby Ray had to learn to walk all over again, and then he spent about a month at home regaining all of his strength. But even after his recovery was deemed to be complete, simple tasks left him exhausted and his memory stayed patchy. The company's policy was that whenever a miner was injured on the job, there was always an open invitation to return to employment. But the reason the company was so generous was because few took them up on the offer. Spend 3 days trapped down in the dark where, with each passing second, you can feel yourself slowly fixing to die, and you're not so keen to jump right back down there. And men refused to return to work after going through way less than Bobby Ray did. Some believe their luck had just sort of run out and it was time to move on. And so you can imagine everyone's surprise when Bobby Ray suddenly announced that he was returning to work with immediate effect. It wasn't just his return that surprised people either, because the man who'd only just been on death's door wasn't just back at work, he was now volunteering for extra shifts. His fellow miners were happy for him at first, and admired his go-get-em attitude. But it wasn't long before their happiness and admiration turned to unease, because the Bobby Ray who showed back up to work was different. The old Bobby had been a talker, and quick with a joke too, but when he came back, he was uncharacteristically cautious and quiet, to the point that he'd hesitate when it came to tasks that he'd once handled with ease. Bobby had to relearn what all considered to be the most basic of mining procedures, and he even had to relearn the layout of entries along with the names of longtime coworkers that he'd known for literally years. It was as if Bobby Ray had come back, but there was someone else at the wheel. As you can imagine, there was a lot of talk about him in the union halls and company houses, as it seemed like every shift that he worked, Bobby would say or do something that'd freak somebody out. Some blamed his behavior on prolonged exposure to bad air and said that prolonged exposure to gases like carbon monoxide might have damaged his brain and altered his personality for good. Others said that what broke him were the endless days and nights lying alone in darkness, while thinking that he'd been abandoned. Now, there was also the head injury to factor into things, as it's pretty well documented that people who suffer CTE can undergo radical personality changes. But whatever the cause was, everyone agreed that Bobby Ray came back different, and that the old one might never come back at all. I was told that while everyone was concerned for him, everyone felt really bad for him too. He wasn't even half the worker he used to be, but no one poked or prodded him too hard about it. Folks just let him be with the obvious expectations, tried to let him find his bearings again on his own. But that only had the opposite effect because over the next couple of months, Bobby's state of mind seemed to grow steadily worse. At first, the decline was barely noticeable. He'd seem overly distracted or seem to forget simple tasks that he'd only just relearned. But soon his fellow miners started noticing a darker side. Sometimes during shifts, he'd slip away from the crew without saying anything to anyone, drifting off into the unworked entries or abandoned headings. On more than one occasion, a coworker found him wandering in the darkness without his cap lamp lit, feeling his way along the rib with his bare hands while whispering to the walls. When the coworker called out, he turned to face them, all glassy-eyed and slow, like they'd just woken him up from a deep sleep. Sometimes, instead of riding the man trip out with the rest of the crew to head home to his wife, Bobby would slip off into the derelict tunnels and work out of random areas, places that had been sealed off for years earlier, and he'd just sort of sleep there. One morning, a foreman found him curled up on a pile of old timber and rock dust in a forgotten crosscut, fast asleep as if he'd spent the entire night down there. No blankets, no food, just the cold and the dark for company. When shaken awake, Bobby seemed confused as to where he was and started to panic. But the foreman said that as his senses returned to him, he calmed to the point of silence and then just wandered back topside to get ready for his shift. A few months in, Bobby Ray's decline had the whole crew on edge, but no one expected it to end the way it did. No one. One afternoon in late 1973, John Joe Crow, who had been well aware of his old friend's strange turn, heard him muttering that he was going to get something before the next cut. It was common for miners to pull fresh oil or new bits between jobs, and they did so from the requisition tent that stood topside, but they tended to only do this towards the start or the end of a break. Bobby Ray, on the other hand, was right in the middle of doing something, and it didn't look like he needed new oil or new bits. John Joe didn't go chasing him down, not at first anyway. He just let his concerns stew till it forced him to check Bobby's rig, and that's how he found out that Bobby was in need of no replacement equipment at all. People had been letting Bobby Ray do just about whatever the heck he liked for weeks on end, but that time, John Joe Crow said that he felt this bad feeling in the pit of his stomach and decided to go after him. Maybe 5 or 10 minutes had passed in the meantime, long enough that John Joe half expected to catch Bobby on the way back to his rig. But all the way to the surface, Bobby Ray was nowhere to be seen. Bobby wasn't in the requisition tent either, and the equipment foreman also appeared absent. But as John Joe looked around, he found the foreman lying behind his counter, unconscious, and having a bloody head wound. Finding the foreman like that was bad enough, but upon looking around, John Joe's blood ran cold, because not only was the foreman's revolver missing, but several containers of highly explosive ANFO had also been taken, and John Joe flew into a panic. He knew that it was Bobby Ray that attacked the foreman, and he knew that it was down to him to stop Bobby from hurting anyone, and so off he ran, wild as a March hare, to find Bobby and stop what was about to happen. I was told he briefly considered just yelling out Bobby's name and letting everyone know they were in danger, but he also figured that if he did, Bobby might just start shooting people. Bobby needed to think everything was just peachy, so when John Joe caught up with him, it'd be him throwing the ambush and not the other way around. John Joe ran all the way up to the Old Man Trip Road, just out of sight of the portal, and there was Bobby, strolling towards the entrance of mine number 44 like he didn't have a care in the world. John Joe caught up with him quick, and as he did, he spotted the pistol grip poking from the back of Bobby Ray's waistband, as well as something bulky strapped tight around his waist under the denim. Not wanting to alarm him, John Joe slowed to a fast walk, and then when he got within arm's length, he yanked the pistol out from Bobby's waistband before he could react. Bobby Ray turned, looking back at the old friend the way a man might look at a stranger, with this calm and distant look on his face. And that's when John Joe worked out what all that bulk was under Bobby's shirt. Strapped to his bare skin using mining tape and wire, Bobby had strapped the stolen containers of ANFO. They turned out to have been crudely rigged, but they were set to blow all right, and by the looks of things, there was enough to bring down the main entries and bury every soul still underground at the time of the explosion. According to the tale I was told, John Joe Crow looked his old friend in the eye and told him, "This ain't like you, Bobby." But the man standing in front of him wasn't Bobby Ray anymore. Whether it be the gases, all that time in the dark, or the blow to the head, it had hollowed him out, and now something else was steering him. Folks say John Joe saw a grim and steely determination in those glassy eyes, and from the way Bobby Ray's hand twitched towards the detonator cord, John Joe knew that there was no talking him down. He just couldn't bring himself to point the pistol and fire until his old pal lunged for him, and when he did, Bobby was dead before he hit the ground. John Joe never went underground again after that. He hung up his proverbial pick and shovel, proverbial because they obviously weren't using either by that period, and retired from the industry for good. There was a full investigation into what happened, and I was told sheriff's deputies were crawling all over mine number 44 for weeks. But since Bobby Ray's body was found with all that explosive strapped to it, it was pretty much an open and shut case, whereby John Joe was cleared of all wrongdoing. But it went further than that, too. Every miner who was on shift that day knew John Joe Crow saved their lives, and they never stopped thanking him for it either. But old John Joe, on the other hand, who never got paid for another drink in a miner's bar for as long as he lived, never liked hearing the thank yous, because to him, they were thanking him for shooting one of his best friends, while John Joe spent the rest of his days wondering if things couldn't have been different. Back in the summer of 2015, my friend and I went camping in the 100-mile wilderness up in Maine. Everyone kind of associates the Appalachian Trail with places like Tennessee and North Carolina. And yes, I get it, those places are like spiritually Appalachia, with their coal mines and snake handlers and fellers wearing dungarees playing banjos, all that stuff. But the trail actually starts way up north, and some of the wilder sections are actually up there and not down south. So that's where me and my buddy headed that year, driving up from Boston to get away from it all for a couple of days. We set up our tents near this little clearing by the stream, then the next morning I woke up early and stepped out for a smoke. It was still nice and cool out and quiet too, so after lighting up I just stood there, half awake and soaking it all in. But then I think I was only maybe 4 or 5 drags in when I heard something rustling behind me, real soft. I turned around slowly, stupidly slowly actually, considering what was about to happen. But when I looked, there was this guy sneaking up on me from maybe 10 feet away. But it wasn't just what he was doing which put me on edge. He looked messed up, and that's putting it lightly. I don't want to say that he looked inbred because, to be honest, I don't even really know what inbreds look like. But I wouldn't be surprised, because his face just looked wrong. His face seemed to be deformed with skin that looked pale and stretched. His forehead had a weird slope to it. He walked with a hunch, and his eyes not only had this unnatural darkness to them, but they were way too close together. His clothes looked new-ish, or at least he wasn't in rags, so someone was taking care of him in some capacity. But in his hand, and this is what scared me the most for reasons that'll become very obvious, was a hatchet. And it looked ancient, with a blade that was pitted and dull. But a hatchet is still a hatchet, you know what I mean? And at first I was sure that he was going to rush me, swing at me. And so I got this adrenaline dump thinking, this is it. Some backwoods psycho is about to chop me up right here by my own tent. But he didn't charge. He just kinda shuffled closer, holding the hatchet out like he wanted me to look at it. I didn't move. I just stared at him, trying not to freak out visibly as his face lit up into this weird sort of childlike way. Like all excited and innocent, but also creepy as hell because this guy looked like 40 at the very youngest. He was grinning this lopsided grin, holding it firmly but gently like it was his favorite toy. And all I could think to do was start talking to him very calm and low, saying, "Hey, buddy. Nice hatchet you got there. Where'd you get it?" I know. Dumb thing to say. It was way more about my tone of voice and making clear that I was no threat to him at all. I kept my voice steady. I kept my hands where he could see them and made no sudden movements. And you know what? It kind of worked. With that same lopsided smile on his face, he started pointing at the hatchet and then at me like we were hatchet bros or something. And while I was extremely relieved that he wasn't hostile, it was eerie as hell. I guess he had the mind of a little kid, so I said just about anything that popped into my head that I thought might keep things chill. Everything's going fine, and I'm slowly kind of backing away from the guy when suddenly my buddy pokes his head out of the tent. Now he's cranky, half asleep, and he's rubbing his eyes, and he starts asking in a loud voice who the hell I was talking to out here so early. His voice was grumpy, like he thought I was on the phone or something, but then the second he heard my buddy's angry voice, the deformed guy, his whole vibe changed instantly. His face twisted up, his eyes got wide and angry, and I remember seeing him grip the hatchet tighter as he took a step closer. I could see the switch flip, that childlike playfulness turning into something angry, almost feral, and seeing it made my stomach drop. The guy's eyes were glued to my friend, who in turn had this horrified look on his dumbstruck face waking up. So acting on pure instinct, I stepped between them while saying, "Nah, buddy, don't do it. Everything's just fine. You just startled us is all." I tried to keep my words simple and soothing, repeating that everything was fine and that he was safe and we weren't enemies. This guy hesitated, looking back and forth between us, all agitated, while my friend, the smart guy that he is, knew to shut the hell up and let me handle it. The tension was thick, real thick. The kind it feels like when you can cut it with a knife, and how all it's going to take is one wrong move and everything's going to hell in a handbasket. The guy muttered some garbled sounds, almost like he was trying to talk but couldn't get the words right. And then he swung the hatchet a little into the air, not directly at us, more like in frustration and fear at some invisible fly. And after that, he started to back up, looking at me and then my buddy, and back again. Now I kept talking to him as softly and calmly as I could, saying no one was going to follow him, and that makes me like 70% sure that he really could understand me, because when I said the thing about not following him, he turned and bolted off into the trees. He was way faster than he looked too, another thing that freaked us out, like his parting gift was showing us just how screwed we would have been if he had decided to attack us. We stood there, watching as he disappeared into the greenery, and then listening until the sounds faded, and then we just stood there, looked at each other, like what the actual F just happened there. I felt like I was in a dream, but we packed up pretty quickly after that, skipping our breakfast and calling time on the whole trip. Talking about it later, my buddy said that he thought that I was losing it when he first came out, but seeing that guy up close, it scared the living crap out of him. We never did figure out where he came from, maybe some isolated family way back in the hills, but regardless, that morning stuck with us. We kind of laughed about it these days, mostly in a nervous way while calling him Hatchet Man, but yeah, that was one camping trip I'll never forget, and a reminder that while we like to think of this country as entirely civilized, there's still people out there who choose a wilder kind of living.